Music theory with OneNote. Chords named by mode and modal half steps, building chords from the minor modes. That includes the minor scale, otherwise known as the Aeolian mode, the Dorian mode, the Phrygian mode, and we're going to throw in even the Locrian mode, the crazy diminished mode. So get ready and some coffee, because although we're only playing with one note, it's a beautiful note that we're playing with. It makes a nice sound. Not required to, but if you have access to it and would like to follow along, we're currently in the OneNote file of the Modal node system, MNS presentation 1175 Excel. Chords named by mode and modal half steps. List of presentations on the right-hand side. We plan on adding plenty more to it shortly. Also noting, in this OneNote presentation, we could spend all of our time on the music theory side of things, but we also have multiple similarly named and numbered presentations where we build these Excel tables, basically one mode at a time, practicing both our Excel skills and music theory skills at the same time, noting practicing the building of tables and actually writing these things down in paper, but I think in Excel actually is just as good, is great practice. All right, what we want to do now is to think about the cleanest way that we can jot down our ideas from a chord standpoint, comparing the current chord structure to what we think would be a more intuitive chord structure, noting that the idea would it be worthwhile to learn the more intuitive structure, considering it should be more streamlined? We're taking as the crow flies past because it's in the air, as opposed to the current system, which is kind of winding around all the mountains that it had to go around in order to put the system together as it advanced through history. Because if we go as the crow flies, then we'll get there faster, and we can then work on communicating, bridging the gap from a communication standpoint, which is going to be helpful and more easy to do these days because we have software like ChatGPT and other AI software that can easily translate any logical system to any other logical system. So that's the idea. So if we have our fretboard down here, remember our analogy, that being that this is the map of the territory. We have 7 continents on the map of the territory. There's actually 12 locations, but the non-continent locations are going to be like the oceans. We go through them to the continent locations. We imagine ourselves in space above the guitar, this being the top heavy low E string, the one closest to the ceiling on the guitar. Our head would be up here. As we look down from space on the world of the fretboard, we note that it shifts to the right. It's spinning. It's spinning to the right. And we are noting and naming 12 different destination locations as it's rotating around. We call those the 12 notes that we can assign for the collection of notes. If we select note number 4, the C note, then we can see this shape will be always the same. Right there, the whole shape will be always the same. All of the 7 continents will be named not by the note necessarily, not by the relative scale degree position, but rather by the absolute, you could call it Nashville number system, or the modes, the unchanging absolute mode system. The Ionian, the Phrygian, the Lydian, the Mixolydian. Those are the ones that we want to name by. If we move this whole thing up, playing from the perspective of our point in space, our head, to C sharp, then the whole thing shifts up. This will still be called C, it will now be called C sharp, but still called the Ionian. And this whole square will shift up. So that means that we want everything terminology-wise to maximize the beauty of the guitar, which is its symmetry. So anything that we can do to maximize the movability, we should do. What's the problem with the current naming construction? It doesn't lend itself to the symmetry. It forces us out of the symmetry because of scale degrees. For example, when we label things like distances, interval-wise, they're based on scale degree, forcing us to renumber the continents, as well as when we talk about chords, because when we name the chords, we might number the chords within the system by scale degree, and if we're on like the minor chord, we might make the minor chord the 1. And that means that we have to learn a whole different numbering system, which is something that obviously is not optimal to do. Also, when we label the notes in the chord, sometimes people actually name the notes in the chord. Okay, but that's not movable. That's not great, because then it would be different if I was going from an A minor chord to some other minor chord. We could also say that we're going to be using scale degrees, but then you would change the scale degree to like a 1-4-5 if you're playing a progression or something like that, or the 1-3-5 if you're playing the notes in a chord. But I'd rather keep the nodes the same, right? It would be, I want this to remain the 6. So that's the problems that we have to basically deal with. So let's intuitively now think about how the chords would be created if you try to create everything within the same diatonic key. The idea being, I'm going to recognize modes exist. I'm going to build chords off of the absolute names that I already have, which is 1 through 7 from a Nashville number system, or the modes. And then I'm going to use distance terminology that starts from the node, measuring from the node, not distance terminology that forces us to make that the 1, making it the scale degree. That would be the easiest and most maneuverable thing to do, the thing that an engineer would do these days if they built the system from scratch these days, which would mean it's equivalent to going the distance as the crow flies, the fast way, the easy way, the way that makes most sense if we didn't have to go around all these mountains with a horse and buggy system. Okay, so last time we went to the Iona. So we have our 12 notes on the right-hand side. We're picking 7 of them. This is now rotating around. So we're going to do the same thing. We're going to be working in the collection of notes, which would be the key of C, the collection of notes related to them. But now we did the major modes last time. We want to go to the minor modes, which are going to start off of the Dorian node, the Phrygian node, the Aeolian node. Now, why are they minor nodes? Because the third happens to have a different distance. It'll have a minor third rather than a major third. We'll get into that later after we discuss intervals. Right now, we'd like to just memorize which are the major modes and which are the minor modes. Most people usually learn the key of C first, or the major scale first, and then they learn the 1-3-5 builds 1-4-5 builds major chords, the 2, 3, and 6 builds minor chords. You just want to tack on to that understanding that the 1-3-5 should better be understood as major modes, and the 2-3-6 should better be understood as minor modes. They're different from each other, but they all have this interval that makes them major or minor, that being a major third versus a minor third. So that means these are going to be more the related modes in terms of the darker or sadder kind of tone to it, because of that third being minor. All right, so as this was we're going to build it the same way, though, by the way. We're just going to start on that note and then pick every other note within our list of 7 nodes. Intuitively, that's how we build it. Remember, and there's 3 ways you usually build things. You build it on the fretboard by shape, or you build it by like formula, which in this case is kind of like after we already have the scale, taking every other note within the scale or collection of notes. Or we can build it by interval. We'll talk more about intervals in future presentations, and then return back to the chords. All right, let's start with the Aeolian mode down here. So we did the Ionian last time, and the Lydian and the Mixolydian. The next most common mode, other than the Aeolian, which is the major key, the Ionian, which is the major key, is the Aeolian or minor. So historically, they took all the modes, right? And they said, we're going to pretend like modes don't exist, and we're going to make the Ionian the thing, the major scale. And then they said, well, we kind of need the Aeolian's kind of cool, so we want to make it the subordinate kind of second kind of scale that we'll use. And so they raised it up to the minor scale rather than the Aeolian mode. What I'd like to do is get back to the idea that, we can say these are the most popular scales or modes, but let's still view them as intertwined. Again, it's just like throughout history, where you think of, is the world the center of the universe and whatnot? It's hard to. Every other place is relative, right? We need to get back to the idea that these things are all related. They're all intertwined to each other. Doesn't mean the major scale is not special in some ways. It just means it's not possibly the center of everything the way we thought about it before, right? Would be the general idea. So and if you do that, if you recognize that, you can come to a much more clear naming convention, which will allow you to do more things more easily with less mental gymnastics. So an A minor. So remember the buckets that we have. The A major, the major is just going to have a major after it, or you could just have the letter alone and assume it's major. If it's a minor, you're going to need a minor after it for the normal naming convention. Sometimes a small m versus a large M would work, but the M's can sometimes be confusing, so oftentimes we put the minor or major. Now, the problem with the minor is just like with the major, it doesn't give us context between the three types of minors that we could have from a song standpoint, which means it would be the Aeolian or the Dorian or the Phrygian. It doesn't give us the context of the song. So it would be better, it would be nicer to do that, to say something like it's an Aeolian A 3-note chord or an A2. Why would that help? Because the 2 here represents that it's 2 modal half steps from the Aeolian node, which happens to be an A. So we're going to say it's the node there plus a distance term of 2 modal whole steps. So hopefully I said that right. 2 modal whole steps from that node. And if it was the root, we can make it a capital A. Say that's the tonic. Notice that if I see this, that gives me way more context, because I can say, oh, look, now I'm playing a song that is in the key of Aeolian. So I know that I don't have to change this 6. I can also call it, by the way, from a natural number system, a 6A2, but that wouldn't allow you to tell you if it's a tonic or not. So I kind of like using the letters here, but it would tell us that that's the tonic and that we're playing in a minor key, as opposed to if this was a D A2, in which case it would be a Dorian song that we're playing. So that should be something that I can see within the chord construction. That would give us a lot more functional usage. Now, again, you could argue that this construction gives you a unique chord from a naming perspective, but again, that's not really the important thing from a music playing standpoint, because again, I don't know from that one chord if I'm playing something in the minor or the Dorian or the Phrygian. Whereas this tells us where I am exactly on the fretboard, and this tells us whether or not it's the tonic or not, if you use a capital or not. That would be way more useful. So then if I say, well, what's going to be the distances? Well, the Aeolian, if we measure distances, we're going to start on the Aeolian and then go up 2 modal half steps or 1 modal whole step, and then up another 2 modal half steps or 1 modal whole step. So that would be a 0, 2, 4. What would that look like? Well, if I start on the A here, we're going to say here's the Aeolian. If I make that the 1 from a scale degree standpoint, 1, skip 2, 3, skip 2 would be the 5. It's constructed the same as the majors, which was the 1, 3, 5. It's just that now there's a different distance between the 1 and the 3 if I look at the actual notes. To know that, we'll have to get into intervals, right? But for right now, intuitively, all you need to know is that the 1, 3, the 1, 4, 5 is major and the 2, 3, 6 is minor. And if you don't change the numbering system, that's always the case. So once I build off of this note, it's the same construction. I just take every other note. From a distance standpoint, it would be 0, 2, 4. So I'd like to be able to name it. Again, if we started from scratch, we would use the proper distance term 0, 2, 4. But from a scale degree, we're going to make this the 1. I don't want to do that because it should be the 6. But if we make it the 1, then it would be 1, 3, 5. It's all off by 1, right? So now it's 1 plus 2 modal half steps plus 2 modal half steps. So I'd like to keep this as the 6, though. Hopefully I said the 6. I might still be on the 5. I was on doing the Mixolydian before. I'd like to keep it the 6, not the 1. Why? One reason is that it gives me a universal way to name the 3-note triad. I could say it's a 6 plus 2 modal whole steps, goes 7, and then to 1 plus 2 modal whole steps is a 3. So I can say from a natural number system, what notes do you hold down? Or what are the continents you hold down? You hold down a 6, 1, 3. I can't do that if I rename the 6 to the 1. Then I would have to renumber the scale degrees that I'd be holding down, which is totally not optimal thing to do. So this way I can say, look, I hold down the Aeolian, the Ionian, the Phrygian. I don't want to rename the Aeolian to 1 and then the Ionian to what, right? That doesn't make any sense to do that way. All right, so let's say we're going to do a 4-note chord. So we do a 4-note chord. What would that normally be called? An A minor 7. The 7 standing for the seventh scale degree if you make the node of the 6 the 1. So 1, 3, 5, 7, the last note in the scale. But it would be better to call it, you could just call it an AA3, right? And that would tell you that it's a 4-note chord. How do you build it? Well, you just start on that node. You don't have to rename the node, and that's the first node plus 3 nodal whole steps from that point. That'll give you more context. Once again, this A minor 7 doesn't really tell you if it's Aeolian, Dorian, or Phrygian. This does. This gives you a lot more context of the song. So if you're trying to jot down, I'm going to come back to this in 3 weeks and look at it, this is going to tell you exactly what you were thinking, or at least a lot closer to it than that, right? And then this, notice it's similar to the C major 7. The 7 of a C major has an interval that is going to be different. It's going to be an 11 note away, whereas this is a 10 note away. And then you note that then they had this G7, which was the Mixolydian, which is actually the same distance for the 7, even though this is a major mode. So we'll talk more about intervals later, but again, we don't really need to know the intervals to intuitively get a feel for the song. It would be great to know the intervals. I recommend doing them and learning it that way too. But it's still just contextually, this is actually more simple to do, to think about what kind of mode you're in, which chord you're playing. So how would we build this over here? So this would be then the Aeolian. It'd be from a scale degree 1, 3, 5, 7. Or from our perspective, it would be the 0, 2, 4, 6. Right? I'm going to start on this node, which is 6, but I'm just going to call it, that's the node we're on, plus 2, 4, 6 distance from that node. All right, so if I go back on over here, we're going to say, all right, well then we would say that be the Aeolian distance-wise, 0, 2, 4, 6. How would we get the scale degree? We would make the 0 a 1, which I don't want to do because it has a name already. It's the 6. But if I make it the 1, it would be 1, 3, 5, 7. 1, 3, 5, 7 scale degrees to build the chord. But I don't want to make that the 1 because I'd like to say if I keep that the 6, I can name each of the nodes that I need to hold down. I need to hold down a 6 plus 2, 6, 7, back to 1. Plus 2 would give us to 3, plus 2 would give us to 5. So I can name the nodes, which are universal and movable, of holding down the chord, which would be a 6, 1, 3, 5, or Aeolian, Ionian, Phrygian, Mixolydian. Okay, let's do the next one. Let's say it's a 5-note chord. If it's a 5-note chord, we normally call that an A minor 9. Now, why is it a 9? There's only 7 notes in the scale degrees because they didn't want to go back to 2, so they went up to 9. So this looks similar to the C major 9, but now we assume that the 7 is flat compared to the major because it's a minor, and then the 9 is kind of funny. This is where it gets weird. This is deceptively complex here because for whatever reason, the minor here, which usually means that you flatten something, only applies to the 3, the 7, right? It doesn't extend to the 9, 11, and 13, right? Which is kind of funny because, and also the Aeolian, you would think would have a minor second, and I'll get into the intervals later, but just to see the complexity of here, it's subtly complex. You would think that it would have a 1 note away minor second, but it doesn't. It still has a major second. So that's why they had to kind of say, well, the 9, we're going to still not flatten the 9. We're going to assume that the 9 is a major 9, okay? Even though the 7 is a minor because it says minor. So the minor still applies to the 7, but we're not flatting the 9. Now, it'd be easier to say, hey, look, I'm just going to pick every other note, call it an Aeolian A4, which would be a 5-note Aeolian A chord. And that means that you're just going to skip every other note to build it. And that would be an easier thing to do. And it would also mean that I'm just going to use the scale degrees that are for the Aeolian mode. So if you want to know the scale degrees, it's just going to be the Aeolian scale degrees. Now, again, you might not know all the Aeolian intervals, right? You might not know all the Aeolian intervals. So you might say, well, it'd be easier not to do that. But again, you probably don't know the intervals anyways, right? You might not know the intervals. So you might as well, and it would be more intuitive just to pick every other note. But it makes more sense to say, look, I'm going to build the chord based on the intervals of this node going forward. I'm using the Aeolian intervals, right? I'm not gonna compare all the intervals to the major. I'm just gonna say, no, these are the Aeolian intervals, would be the idea. You can compare them to the major intervals and still say, what's the comparison? But that's not, you can't really see that here. This gives you the context to say, look, just take every other note from this node, or if you want to count it by interval, which we'll talk about later, just assume the Aeolian intervals, right? And that would be it. So we'll talk more about intervals later, though. So that would be from a scale degree 1, 3, 5, 7, 9, right? And this 9 is now equivalent to the 2. The 9 is equivalent to the 2. From our standpoint, 0, 2, 4, 6, 8 would be the ideal. Let's just erase this bit, and then go back on over. All right. So that means that if we name this from a distance term, it's going to be 0, 2, 4, 6, 8 modal half steps, right? It's the second modal half step, the fourth modal half step, the sixth modal half step, the eighth modal half step, versus scale degrees, making this the 1 would mean first 1, 3, 5, 7, 9, the 9 being equivalent to the 2. I don't want to make this the 1 again. Why? Because I'd like to be able to name all of the nodes. I'd like to be able to say, hey, look, I'm starting on the 6 plus 2, 7, 1, plus 2 to the 3, plus 2 to the 5, plus 2 to the 7, plus 2. Well, that's it. So that'd be 6, 1, 3, 5, 7, or Aeolian, Ionian, Phrygian, Mixolydian, Locrian. All right, let's do the full one. If I did a full 6th note, and well, I'm on the 6th note, it would be an A minor 11. The 11 is representing the 4. So it goes 1, 3, 5, 7, 9, and then the 11, which is equivalent to the 4. But it would be easier just to say, hey, look, I'm just going to say it's an Aeolian A5, or a 6A from a Nashville number system, a 6A5, if you want to say it that way, right? And that will tell you that I'm in the Aeolian mode, and you're just going to pick every other note. You're going to start on the Aeolian and pick every other note. Or if you want to see it from scale degrees or the intervals, then you're going to use the Aeolian intervals, right? And so then it's going to be an AA5. That'll tell you that it's the tonal center. So if I go back on over from a scale degree standpoint, 1, 3, 5, 7, 9, 11, and the 11 is equivalent to the 4. All right, so there's that. And so then we're going to say, okay, let's go back on over here. And so now we're going to say it's going to be then the Aeolian. It's going to be a 0, the second modal half step, the 4th modal half step, the 6th modal half step, the 8th modal half step, and the 10 modal half step. If we convert that to scale degrees, we make that the 1, and we say it's going to be the 1, 3, 5, 7, 9, 11. It's all off by 1. All right, but I don't want to make that the 1 because, again, I would like to keep that as the 6 so that I can name the nodes 6, 1, 3, 5, 7, 2. All right, now this is getting to be a long chord. You can't usually hold it down on the guitar, so typically under either conventions, we assume all of those notes, and we assume that you're going to be adding the last one and possibly dropping something in the middle, like the 5 or something. All right, so let's go, what's this, a 7-note chord? If it's a 7-note chord, we might call it an A minor flat 13. Now, why is that? Because remember how this works. Now, it gets a little wonky here, and I will get more into this later, but we assume that it's a minor, which means that that's going to make a minor out of the 3 and the 7. But then the 9 we couldn't flatten, so we keep it major, even though it says minor, and then the 11 is also major, but it's perfect, so it's okay. We'll talk about the intervals later. But then the 13 is equivalent to the 6, and the 6 should be minor, and we're saying that everything after the 7 we're going to say is still major, even though we said minor here. So that means we have to flat the 13. So I'm pretty sure that that's the general idea. We'll talk more about, again, the normal naming convention later. But I just want to point out that if you're in the Dorian mode, in the minor scale, we shouldn't have anything that kind of forces us to make it look like it's not in the key, right? It should be something clean. Unless I'm picking a note that's in the ocean, it's outside the diatonic key, you would think we would come up with a numbering system that would always be clean, right? It would be clean as long as it's in the diatonic key. I should be able to see there's something funny going on. And if there's something funny going on, that means they picked a note that's outside of the diatonic key. That's the way I feel like it should be. And I think it's clearly that's the way it should be. Anyway, so we're going to say from a scale degree, there'll be 1, 3, 5, 7, 9, 11, 13. The 13 is equivalent to the 6. Okay, so then that's going to be the idea. We would say it's a 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14. I think, did I get that right? I hope so. Let me erase this. I want to keep rolling because we've got like an extra one to go through this time with the Locrian. All right, so then that means we're going to say that's going to be Aeolian distance-wise, 0, 2 modal half steps, 4 modal half steps, 6, 8, 10, 12. Scale degree means we make the 6 the 1, 1, 3, 5, 7, 9, 11, 13, 9, 11, 13 equivalent to the 2, 4, and the 6. But I don't want to make that the 1. I want to keep it as the 6. So I can name the nodes 6, 7, 6, 7, 1, 1, 2, 3, 3, 4, 5, 5, 6, 7, 7, 1, 2, because there's only 7 of them. And then 2, 3, 4 gives us the notes. Again, that's too long of a chord to play, but we would assume that we're adding the 13 if it was in the name and dropping something in the middle, which we can get more specific about later. All right, so let's now go back up to the Dorian. So the Dorian is what we call the 2. Now, the reason I did the 6 first is because it's the main minor. The Dorian has intervals that are going to be more similar to the minor than the Ionian. But from just a building standpoint, it looks the same. We're just going to start on the Dorian and take every other note from the Dorian, and it has a minor mode because it has a minor third. We'll talk about the intervals more later. So normally we would call that a D minor. So notice that D minor looks like the A minor. That's great because it's a unique name, but there's a problem that it doesn't tell me the context of the song. If I say I'm playing D minor, that doesn't tell me that I'm actually looking for something that's in the Dorian. It has the same triad, but I want the context of the song. I'd rather call it's a Dorian D2, meaning it's a 3-note D Dorian chord. Notice the Dorian isn't always a D. It just happens to be a D here. So it's a 3-note Dorian chord. That's what we would like to be calling it because that will give us the context that we're not only playing a 3-note triad that happens to have the same measurements as a minor, but that we're in the key of Dorian. That tells me where I am on the fretboard, and that allows me to visualize the entire fretboard from node number 2. If I just see this, I don't know if I'm on node number 2 or node number 3 or node number 6, right? And I could get even more detailed and say, look, that's a DD2, and that would tell me that this is the node we're on, and it's the tonal center of the song. So now it's telling me that just tells me that this is a song mainly based in the Dorian key, because that's the tonal center, and we're saying it's the Dorian chord. Even though it only has a triad, which would be the same as the minor, the flavor of the song should be in the Dorian, right? And that tells me where I am on the fretboard. So then we're going to say the distance will be 0, 2, 4. So if I go back on over here from the Dorian, we're going to say it would be Dorian. If from a scale degree, it would be the 1, 3, 5. From our perspective, it would be 0, 2, 4 distance-wise. That's how you build it. And so if I go back on over here, we'd say, okay, that would be Dorian 1, 3, 5. So we would build it 0, 2, 4 distance. They want to make the Dorian, which I would like to call the 2, the 1, to make it the scale degree, which would make it 1, 3, 5. 1 plus 2 modal half steps plus 2 modal half steps, distance-wise. So I want to see distance, and they're using distance but renaming the scale degree. I don't want to make this the 1 because I want to make it, keep it the 2, because then I can name the nodes. The nodes do not include the Aeolian node. They include the Dorian node, right? The Dorian node plus 2 gives me to the 4, plus 2 gives me to the 6, which gives me an absolute Nashville number system name of the Dorian 3-note chord, which is going to be a 2, 4, 6, or it has a Dorian, Lydian, and Aeolian in it, right? And then what if I add another note? We're going to go to the D minor 7 is what we call it. That's going to be a 4-note chord. So from a scale degree, it added the 7. Okay, but it looks like the A minor 7. That's a problem because, again, I'd like to be able to see a distinction from a playing standpoint as to whether I'm playing in the position of a Dorian or a major, even though it has the same relative positions because they're different locations on the fretboard, right? And so I'd rather call it a D3, meaning it's going to be a Dorian chord with 3 modal whole steps that we're going to be adding to it, which means it's going to be 0 plus 2 plus 4, 2, 4, 6, right? Which would be equal to the 1, 3, 5, 7. And I could make it the center like this. So the distance I would like to call it is the Dorian 0, 2, 4, 6. Start on that node. From a scale degree, they're going to call that the 1. I want to call it the 2, but they call it the 1, 1, 3, 5, 7. Let's look at that over here. So we're going to say, all right, it's the 1, 3, 5, 7. I would like to call it 0, 2, 4, 6. See, from a distance standpoint. And so if I go back on over, I want to call it not the 1, because if I keep it as the 2, I can give it an absolute name. It's going to be the 2 plus 2 is 4, plus 2 is 6, plus 2 is 1, or 2, 4, 6, 1. That's what we hold down. Dorian, Lydian, Aeolian, Ionian. All right, what about a 5-note chord? So if it's a 5-note chord, we call that a D minor 9. So again, it looks like this chord. So it's going to be looking the same thus far, which isn't good from a playing standpoint because it doesn't give us the context of the song. The 9, once again, represents the 2, and we still have a major 2 on the Dorian, even though it's a minor mode, which is funny. So the minor applies to the 3 and the 7, but not to the 9. So that's kind of weird. So that, but if we just call it a DD4, then again, that tells us that we're playing a minor triad, and it has the minor intervals from that point going forward, or not the minor intervals, the Dorian intervals. So I don't need to say, hey, look, this is different than the minor or different from the major or whatever. I'm just saying, look, I'm taking every other note from that node, and therefore I'm using the Dorian intervals. And you might say, I don't know the Dorian intervals. Well, I'm sure is it harder to know the Dorian intervals than to know that the D minor 9? Right? It's easier to see it this way in the context of the song to easily build it. And then you're going to have to learn the intervals that are specific to each of the different destination locations between each of the nodes, one way or the other. If you want to advance from there, this would be a cleaner way to do it, I believe, because that'll actually tell you. You will learn once you get into the intervals related to each of the modes, rather than just intervals that aren't in the context of how you would play it within a song. But you can make it the tonal center again, so it would be Dorian 2, 4, 6, 8, and then the scale degree would be the 1, 3, 5, 7, 9, 9 equivalent to the 2. If I looked at that over here, scale degree terminology would be 1, 3, 5, 7, 9. The 9 here equivalent to the 2, right? So then, but I would like to call it then the 0, 2, 4, 6, 8. Okay. So then we can go back on over and say, all right. So I don't want to make that the 1. I want to keep it as the 2, because then I can name the nodes. 2 plus 2 is 4, plus 2 is 6, plus 2 is 7, and then 1, plus 2 is 3, and then that would give us it. 2, 4, 6, 1, 3. All right, let's do the next one. It's a 6-note chord. So for the Dorian, that would be a D minor 11. So now we have the D minor 11 because we have the 7 is minor considered. Then the 9 is equivalent to the 2, but it's major for the Dorian and the Aeolian. And then the 11 is equivalent to the 4th, which is perfect. So it's going to be the same as well. So this somewhat clean of a chord looking, but again, it doesn't give us the context of if it's Dorian or minor. I'd rather call it a DD5 or a capital DD5, which you could call a 2D5 if you want to use the Nashville number system instead of the letter. And that would give us, and that would tell us that it's going to be starting on the D node or the Dorian node, which happens to be a D this time. And then we're going to go up 2 modal half steps. We just include 2 modal half steps from there, and that's how you build the chord. All right, and so then we have, what does that look like over here? Let's see if I can, let's see, okay. This thing, why is this doing that? What is happening? So we're gonna have a Dorian 2, 4, 6, 8, 10 versus a scale degree 1, 3, 5, 7, 9, 11. So let's look at that over here. So we're gonna say, all right, now we have the 1 from a scale degree 1, 3, 5, 7, 9, 11. The 11 is equivalent to the 4. I would like to call it 2, 4, 6, or I'm sorry, 0, 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, which would all be off by, or the scale degrees are all off by 1 from the normal way that you would do it if you were counting distance. And then we're going to say, all right, so that I don't want to make that the 1. I want to keep that as the 2, because then I can say 2 plus 2 is 4, 4 plus 2 is 6, 6 plus 2 is 6, 7, then back to 1, 1 plus 2 is 3, and then 3 plus 2 is 6. So now I deleted the wrong one. Let's go to the next one. So now we have a Dorian, a D minor 13. D minor 13. Let's see if I can mark it up. D minor 13. I don't want to mark it up. Ah, man. Now I want to unmark it up. Let's not do that. Let's not do that. So it's a D minor 13. So that means that we have all of the notes now. So we've gone up to the 13. So we had the 7, and then the 9 is equivalent to the 2, and it's major. And then the 11 is equivalent to the 4, and it's perfect. But then the 13, we saw on the minor had to be a flat 13, and that's different up here. It's kind of funny that the Dorian actually doesn't need something funny happening, because it actually has a 13, which is equivalent to the 6 that has the same as a major, and therefore it actually looks normal, whereas the minor has the flat 13. So again, that shouldn't really be the case, because it would be better to say, look, I don't need to flat the 13 or not flat. I could just say it's a Dorian D6, meaning it's going to be the Dorian node plus 6 modal whole steps. And that means that you just take every other note, and it means from an interval standpoint, it has the intervals of the Dorian, meaning the distance between all of the nodes from the starting point is always the same. And we'll talk about that later, but that would be a lot easier to put together clearly, and it'll give you context to the song. So Dorian 0, 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12 versus scale degree 1, 3, 5, 7, 9, 11, 13. If I go back on over here, we say, all right, scale degree 1, 3, 5, 7, 9, 11, 13. Locrian, the 13 is equivalent to the 6, right? Okay, and I'd like to call it 0, 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12. So the scale degrees are all off by 1 if you were to use a more logical or less complex system that doesn't make you do the workarounds. All right, so that's going to give you then the Dorian. So if I make this the 2, then I could say it's a 2, 4, 6, 1, 3, 5, 7, 5, 7. All right, let's keep going because we're running long on time. Let's then move to the Phrygian. So the 2, 3, and 6 are minor modes. The Aeolian is the main minor. So then we have the Phrygian is the other minor mode. It's minor because it has a minor third. We'll get into the intervals later, but from an intuitive standpoint, we know it's a minor. So we could see the A minor, the Aeolian minor is called a minor, and then the Dorian minor, this D doesn't stand for Dorian, it's a D note, and then the E. So these are all the minors that happen to be the 2, 3, and 6, built off the 2, 3, and 6, right? But the fact that it says E minor doesn't tell me any context of the song, because right now I'd like that E minor to tell me it's in a Phrygian. It's a Phrygian. So if I say it's an E minor, I can build an E minor down here, and it would be the same 3 notes, whether I call it a Phrygian, a Dorian, or a minor Aeolian. See, but I don't know what the shape is around it from that context. I don't know what the flavor of the song is. So it would be better in the context of the song to say, look, this is a Phrygian E2, which would mean it's a Phrygian E chord, 3-note chord, going on the node of the Phrygian, which is the E note in this case, and then up 2 modal whole steps, a measurement term. And if it was the tonic, I can capitalize it, and it would be a capital. You could also call it a 3D2 if you want to use the Nashville number. Now I did it again with the D instead of the P. All right, I fixed it. So you can call it a capital E, PE2. So that gives you a lot more context, because now I can say, oh, I know exactly what's happening now because I know that node. I know where that node is, which lets me orient the entire shape around it. If that's one of 3 nodes, then I can build the chord no matter which node it is, but I don't know where it is actually located. I'm still ambiguous as to where it is. And obviously from a song standpoint, our goal is not to be ambiguous. Our goal is to give as much information in as small a context as possible. That gives me the tonal center of the song. It tells me that it's a 3-note triad, tells me how to build it, and it tells me where it lies in the overarching shape of the song. That makes way more sense, right? And then, so we could call that a 0, 2, 4 from a distance standpoint. So it's going to be the 2nd modal whole step and then the 4th modal whole step. And if we do a scale degree, 1, 3, 5. So if I looked at that over here, we'd say, okay, we're going to start on the Phrygian. So we're going to say this is the 1, 3, 5, or I would call it the 0, 2, 4. Okay, so then if I go back on over and we go, okay, I don't want to call that the 1. I want to keep it as the 3, because then I can name this 3 plus 2 gives me 5 plus 2 gives me 7. So I'd like to call this from a Nashville number system. I'm holding down not the 1, 3, 5. I'm holding down the 3, 5, 7, the non-changing nodes of the Phrygian, Mixolydian, and Locrian. That's specific, way more specific. So then I can say, okay, what if we have a 4-note chord? Now we have an A minor 7. So that's great, but it looks like an E minor 7 looks like the minor 7 over here and the minor 7 over here. So the Dorian, the Aeolian, and the Phrygian all look the same, have the same structure. That could be nice. You could say, well, that makes it easy because they all have the same structure. But no, it's actually more difficult because it doesn't tell you where you are on the fretboard. It doesn't tell you where you happen to be. It would be better in the context to say, look, I'm playing in the Phrygian, a Phrygian E3. Now, if you have no context, what if you're saying, well, I don't have any context, I'm just naming the chord? Well, then you might default to the minor chord, right? I would default to the minor. But usually you're playing within the context of a song. So if you have context, language happens in context. This is a language. You would like it to be like a PE3. So you're going to have a Phrygian E that has 3 modal whole steps from that point, or make it the capital. So that would mean that we're on the Phrygian, and we can call it then the points of 2 modal whole steps, 4 modal whole steps, 6 modal whole steps, which would be, if we convert it to scale degrees, making the 3 the 1, it would be a 1, 3, 5, 7. So let's count it out over here. We have 1, 3, 5, 7. I'd like to call it 0, 2, 4, 6. Okay, and so let's go back on over. So now we're on, I want to call it a 3 and not a 1, because then I can say it's a 3 plus 2 is 5 plus 2 is 7. 7 plus 2 goes around the horn to 2. So this would include the nodes of a 3, 5, 7, 2, or Phrygian, Mixolydian, Locrian, Dorian. All right, what about a 5-note chord. That would be an E minor flat 9. Now that looks different than the Aeolian and the Dorian. Why? Because the Phrygian is actually more minor than the main minor mode. It has a flat 9, meaning a minor 2 or a minor 9. So remember that the 9 represents the 2 in essence, and for whatever reason, the minor mode, the Aeolian, still has a major 2. We'll talk more about that when we get to the intervals, but the Phrygian is more minor because it actually has a minor 2, which is equivalent to the 9. Now, that gets messy. I would rather call it a PE4, because that means you can construct it by just taking every other note from that node. It's 5-note chord. The E is going to be the note we're on, plus every other step. Or you can build it by scale degrees by just saying, look, it has all the, build it by intervals, distance, by saying, look, it just has all of the same distances as the Phrygian mode. Those are all the intervals, the Phrygian intervals. That's the ones we're using, right? And so that would be easier. You shouldn't have to do this, then you wouldn't have to do this, because this looks like something that you would have to do if it's out in the ocean. If you're including a chord that has a note that's out in the ocean, that's when you'd have to include something like this, right? If it's not including a chord out in the ocean, then it should be it should be easy, right? The naming convention should be easy. So then we call it a Phrygian 0, 2, 4, 6, 8, which would be equivalent to a scale degree of, if we make the 3 the 1, 1, 3, 5, 7, 9. So if I go over here, we're going to say, all right, scale degree 1, 3, 5, 7, 9, and the 9 is equivalent to the 2. I'd like to call it 0, 2, 3, 4, 6 because I think that would be the more logical system. All right, so let's go back on over. And so now we're going to say, if I kept that as the 3, I can then name all of the nodes in the system. It'd be 3 plus 2 is 5, plus 2 is 6, and then back to 7. 6, 7, and then 7 plus 2 goes around to 2, and then plus 2 is 4, and those would be the nodes to build the chord. All right, let's do the next one. Let's say it's a 6-note chord. What would we call that? An E minor 11 flat 9. Why? So this is getting kind of ugly, right? Because the Dorian now has an 11, which is equivalent to the 4. That's still a perfect, but the 9 is equivalent to the 2, and the minor doesn't flatten the 2 for whatever reason, because it only flattens the 3 and the 7. So that means you have to add the flat 9 to it. So again, that's kind of ugly. It would be easier to say it's a Phrygian E5, which would be a 6-note Phrygian chord. That looks like it's in the same key, right? And you can make it the tonic. So then we can say over here, it would be from a scale degree 1, 3, 5, 7, 9, 11. The 11 is equivalent to the 4. I would like to call it 0, 2, 4, 6, 8, 10. Would make more sense. But, not everyone likes to make sense. I tell you, if you could try to make music without making sense, but I'm telling you, it's not as easy. You're doing it the hard way. You're doing it the hard way. Okay, so now I'm doing this again, where I've got these 2 that are happening. So now we're going to say it's the Phrygian 0, 2, 4. Why is this happening? Move back. It's the 0, 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, which from a scale degree would, if we make that the 1, 1, 3, 5, 7, 9, 11. I don't want to make it the 1 because I want to keep that as the 3 so that I can name all the notes. So it's all the nodes. 3 plus 2 is 5, plus 2 is 7, plus 2 goes around the horn to 2, plus 2 goes to 4, plus 2 goes to 6. All right, let's go to it. The last one, we're going to do a 7-note. So now we're on a 7-note. So we're going to say it's going to be an E minor 13, flat 9, flat 13. I hope I got that right. I think I did. So and that's because it's an E minor, which means it's going to have a minor 3rd, the minor 7, but the minor doesn't apply to the 9, 11, and the 13. But the 9 in our case is equivalent to the 2, which should be flattened. So we have to flatten it. And then the 11 is okay because it's perfect. But then the 13 is equivalent to the 6. And the 6 needs to be flattened for what am I on? The Phrygian. So we have to flatten the 6, similar to what we did with the minor. So you get this kind of ugly thing. Hopefully, I'm almost positive I've got that right. But the point is, it's ugly. It shouldn't be something complicated like that. If you see that, you're going to say, there's no way that's in the same diatonic key. There's got to be notes out in the ocean that is happening here, right? But no, so you should have a system where it's clean unless there's notes out in the ocean, right? So it should, if you just call it a PE6, you could say, look, it's a Phrygian chord around the E, and it's a 7-note chord, meaning you go from the E and you go 6 modal whole steps up, or you just, from the interval standpoint, use the Phrygian intervals, right? That's all you have. So, and then that would be Phrygian 0, 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12 from a scale degree, 1, 3, 5, 7, 9, 11, and 13. If we measure it back over here, scale degree 1, 3, 5, 7, 9, 11, 13. The 13 is equivalent to the 6. And I would like to call it 0, 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12. All right, let's erase that. Okay. So then we're going to go on over and go, I want to get to the Locrian. So this is going to be a long one. So I would like to call that, then keep that as the 3. So 3 plus 2, 3 plus 2 is 5, plus 2 is 7, plus 2 goes around the horn of 2, plus 2 is 4, plus 2 is 6, plus 2 is 1. Around the horn 7, then back to 1. All right, let's go to the Locrian. Now the Locrian is the 7. So a lot of people kind of ignore the Locrian because it's kind of crazy. But you need it from a chord standpoint because you need the tension. You need the tension to release. So we can build the Locrian. It still has a flat third on it, similar to the minor. So it's kind of like a minor, but then it also has a flat 5. That's the thing that makes it really weird. So we're going to say, all right, we're on the Locrian. So what do we call it? So it's going to be a B diminished. So if it's just the triad, we're going to call it the diminished. And the Locrian, this is how I kind of think of it. We'll talk more about this later. But we have another bucket now, right? So we have the major bucket. We've got the minor bucket. And then once we add the 7, we have the 7 bucket, the 7 chords. So, but now we have another bucket for the Locrian, which are going to be the diminished. And then we're also going to have a half diminished bucket. So that means if it's a triad, just 3 notes, we call it basically a diminished, which is the thing that's going to basically it's basically saying it has a minor interval, a minor third, and then it's flattening the 5th. All right, so that's going to be the general idea from a practical standpoint. All right, so if we built that out over here, we're going to say we're on the B, and so it would be on the Locrian would be here 1, 3, 5 from a scale degree standpoint. I'd like to call it 0, 2, 4, 0, 2, 4. Okay, so then I think it would be better just to call it an NB2. Now N stands for Locrian. You could call it a 7B2 from a Nashville number of music, but an NB2 because the Locrian, I'm taking the last letter first because it's the crazy one. It's backwards, and I don't want the L because it looks like a 1. So then, and we could capitalize it if we were playing in the key of Locrian, which would be quite weird. But, so this one is kind of unique. We don't have it mixed up with the minors at least, but it's quite intimidating to say diminished. I think it's actually less intimidating to say, look, we're building a chord off of the 7, which naturally builds a Locrian chord, which has a flat 5. So we would say the points would be at the node would be the same. We build it the same way, 0, 2, 4. And we then say from a scale degree, they'd make that the 1, 3, 5. But I don't want to make that the 1 because if I keep it as the 7, I can name the nodes to build the Locrian. 7 plus 2 goes around the horn to 2, plus 2 goes to 4. So I can say this Locrian triad has 7 to 4, or Locrian, Dorian, Lydian nodes. All right, this is where it gets weird. So now we're going to say, all right, what if we make a 4 note? Well, notice we no longer say diminished. We say this sign means half diminished. Now, half diminished is kind of like what they did with the 7 chords over here for the Mixolydian. It's basically saying, hey, look, we're just going to make this be the Locrian intervals. You might as well have called it the Locrian, a Locrian, right? Because it's basically making the Locrian. But the technical thing was, well, the diminished is going to be, we're going to assume it's going to be like the minors intervals in essence, the minor interval, and then the diminished is going to flat the third. But if we kept the full diminished, it would also flatten the 7. And we don't want to flatten the 7 because that would lead to a double flat of the 7. So we have to then say there's a half diminished, which doesn't flatten the 7, but it still assumes that the minors were like on the minor scale baseline, and then it flattens the 5. All right, that's really ugly. You can maybe get some technical rationale on how they stack the chords, and that's going to be a unique name and so on and so forth. But really, from a playing standpoint, I'm not so concerned that it's a unique name. I'm concerned that it's hard to understand it. It doesn't tell me the context of the song. I mean, it'd be easier just to say, look, this is just an NB3, a Locrian 4-note B chord. You start on the B and you take every other node, and that's going to have the Locrian intervals, right? It has the Locrian intervals. That's what we're playing in. And the only argument I can see against that might be, well, that's not unique, maybe, and this is going to give us a unique technical kind of name. But I don't understand why that would be beneficial from a playing standpoint. The context of the song is important for the language that we're using here, right? Not anyway. So in any case, we're going to say you can make it a capital. So I'm going to call it a Locrian 0246, which I convert to a scale degree. If we did that, making it the 11357. So once again, if I was over here, we'd say it would be from a scale degree 1357. I'd like to call it 0246. Okay, let's go to the next one. And so now we're going to say, I'd like to keep this as the 7, because then I can say it's 7 plus 2 goes around the horn to 2, plus 2 goes to 4, plus 2 goes to 6. Those would be the nodes involved. Let's make a 5 note. So now we have this standard naming convention, which again kind of just means these are the Locrian intervals. So I say it's a B half diminished 9. So now we're going to say, well, the half diminished flattens the 5, and it kind of has the baseline of a half diminished, kind of means that we're going to have the intervals of the minor up, right, is going to be the general idea. And I thought that only extended before to the 7, but then I think it actually extends out to the 9, 11, and 13. So basically it's just saying, hey, look, we're using the Locrian intervals. It is basically what's happening, kind of like what happened with the 7 chords. So if you see that half diminished, we're like, okay, that must be, if it was a triad, it would have been fully diminished for whatever reason. And then they waited until it adds the 7 to force you to do the funny thing, which is to make it half diminished, and then everything from there forward would be the half diminished, is kind of one way to visualize it. All right, but in any case, it would be easier just to say that. Look, I'm just going to call it a Locrian 5-note Locrian chord. It's a Locrian B4, meaning you start on that node and you take every other nodal whole step. And if we're playing in that, we can make it a capital. You can make it a 7B4 for a Nashville number system if you wanted to. So, and that would mean that it has the 02468 from a scale degree, 13579. So if I looked at it over here, we've got the 13579. The 9 is equivalent to the 2, as we've seen before. All right, let's go back on over. So I don't want to make that the 1, though. I don't want to keep it as the 7. So I can say 7 plus 2 is 2, plus 2 is 4, plus 2 is 6, plus 2, 6, 7, around to 1 to give us the actual nodes that are in the system. All right, what if it's a 6-note chord. Then we're going to call it a B half diminished 11, which again just basically means it's a Locrian chord at this point. So that means we went to the 9 is equivalent to the 2 and the 11 is equivalent to the 4. I think it'd be better just to say, hey, look, it's a Locrian B chord. We're on the Locrian. We're on the 7 node, right? And so you can say you start on that node and you take every other nodal half step. You take the intervals that are the Locrian intervals, if you want to think about it that way. And that would mean that you'd have the 0, 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, or scale degree 1, 3, 5, 7, 9, 11. So if I go back on over here, we're going to say scale degree 1, 3, 5, 7, 9, 11. The 11 is the same as the 4. All right. So then let's go back on over. All right. So now we're going to say, I'd like to keep that as the 7, because then you'd have 7 plus 2 is 2 going around the horn, plus 2 is 4, plus 2 is 6, plus 2 is 7, 1, plus 2 gets you to 3, right? That would be better. Let's pull this on over. This should be over here, I think. Something got weird. Something got weird. Things got weird, man. All right, let's say we made a 7-note chord. So now it'd be a D half diminished 13. So the 13 is equivalent to the 6. So again, it just basically means we're in the Locrian intervals. And we're going to say, I would rather just say we're in the Locrian, be an NB6, meaning it's a Locrian chord with 7 notes. Just take every other nodal half step from the node we're on. That would be a modal half steps of 0, 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, which would give us scale degrees of 1, 3, 5, 7, 9, 11, 13. 9, 11, 13 equivalent to the 2, 4, and 6. So if I do it over here, scale degrees 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, scale degrees 1, 3, 5, 7, 9, 11, 13, 13 equivalent to the 6. I would like to call it 0, 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12 distance term. Okay, and so the problem with the scale degree is that if you make that the 1, you can't give it an absolute number. I don't want to keep it as the 7. Plus 2 would be 2. Plus 2 would be 4. Plus 2 would be 6. Plus 2 would be 7. Then back to 1. Plus 2 would be 3. Plus 2 would be 5. So I'd like to say this long chord, if I can hold it all down, would be 7, 2, 4, 6, 1, 3, 5. Right? You can't play the whole thing on the guitar like that, but you're probably going to play the last bit, the mixolydian, and drop something in the middle. Right? Maybe not. We'll drop something in the middle. That's the general idea. Okay.